Which brings us to, there are other notes aside from this. We will talk about some other teams and other players, but the big news rumor nugget of the day is Donovan Mitchell maybe on the block in Utah. Woj essentially reported that Danny Ainge, CEO and alternative governor, how's that for a title, of the team, is no longer shutting other suitors down when they call about Mitchell, and they had called, obviously, in the wake of Rudy Gobert being moved, and I'm sure also beforehand, because teams are constantly having discussions, and we know about maybe 1% of the talks that actually happen when you really get behind the scenes and know like what's being exchanged and what scenarios are at play, and just all the different balls that are in the air there. So Donovan Mitchell can apparently be had for the right price. That's not really shocking because, as Justin Zanuck said, he isn't looking. The Jazz aren't looking to trade Donovan Mitchell per se, but that nobody is untouchable. Look, when you view this from the Jazz perspective, there were a bunch of Jazz fans in our YouTube comments and on Twitter that said, no, they're going to rebuild around Mitchell. That was the report. That was like just never going to be the thing. And I'm not even saying that they'll 100% move Mitchell before the season. I think what drove up the asking price for Rudy Gobert was the fact that the Jazz were okay not moving him. And when we look at these offers, what they got specifically for Rudy Gobert, roughly $2 trillion first-round picks, or the equivalent, however you want to value those. If you don't see a second team or a third team or another suitor that was going to as aggressively go after Rudy Gobert, you might just decide, well, then Minnesota overpaid. Maybe Minnesota did overpay, but if you thought that the Jazz weren't going to trade Rudy Gobert otherwise, it wasn't a matter of, oh, the Hawks went after them with this offer, or I don't even know what other team would have, or the Charlotte Hornets went in with this offer, or the Blazers tried to do this. It could have just been a matter of the Jazz were going to keep him. They were prepared to run it back or to at least keep Rudy Gobert. It's going to be the same story with Donovan Mitchell. Now, he is really good. He will improve their record a great deal if they keep him. Their roster that they have now, the moves can't be done even if you keep Mitchell. It's so damn guard heavy. But he's not someone who's going to torpedo like your retooling or your rebuild if you hold on to him. So I think there is, I probably would bet against it at this point, him starting the season in Utah, but there's still a scenario in which this leaks into the season. But to have discounted it or dismissed it altogether before now, just because that's what the Jazz were saying or that's what was coming out via Woj and some other reporters, it's just like, that's not how this works. And the writing wasn't just on the wall. Like, the Jazz said it themselves in the move with Rudy Gobert that they were open for business, that they were going to try and enter a different era. There have been rumblings for years that Donovan Mitchell wouldn't stay in Utah long-term anyway. And so looking at his contract to see that there are only 3 years left, the trade request territory, I'm not saying it would have came, or maybe it came already if this is why this whole thing is out there. But my point being, once you get to 2 years left before free agency, unless you're Kevin Durant, apparently, like, that's when you sort of enter these trade request territories. And that's something the Jazz had to think about. Maybe, look, the stuff with Mitchell and not liking Utah could be overblown. I don't think the stuff with him and Rudy Gobert is necessarily overblown. I don't think the concerns about the Jazz's chemistry last year were overblown overall. But there are elements of this entire story that have been exaggerated. And so I'm not saying Utah is the shittiest place to play or is a crappy organization. I think the organization has proven itself. It could not get over that hump, but they did a really good job of developing some guys, including Rudy Gobert, finding Donovan Mitchell, Royce O'Neal as well. They made a couple of all-in trades when you look at Bojan Bogdanovic, and when you also look at Bojan Bogdanovic was through free agency, but you get my point. Trading for Mike Conley, that proved to be not enough, and then maybe they didn't go in hard enough after that with what limited assets they have. The organization is, look, I thought that this era of Jazz basketball, it's over. I think it's over. I mean, Rudy Gobert left. It's over. It's disappointing, but only because those expectations of something greater existed to begin with. I, however, respect this idea that they weren't quite in the middle, but they were sub-contenders, and they clearly want to be something more. And so if you're allowing yourself to entertain offers for Donovan Mitchell, you are at least providing clarity, chasing a separate direction. And that's something that I can respect because there are teams that time and again have failed to do that. I think you can point to the Knicks as one, and this is not a Knicks for clicks situation. The Kings, for sure. The Charlotte Hornets might be the epitome of chasing mediocrity in the NBA. So I think this is the right move if the Jazz weren't going to go all in on other moves. And this is to say, what other moves were there for them to go all in on? You can prioritize cap flexibility moving forward. That's just not, it wouldn't have meant a lot to begin with. Free agents were never flocking to Utah in droves. And also, players aren't leaving in free agency anymore. It's happening via trade or you're finding stars in the draft. And also, the trade market right now, aside from Kevin Durant, like, who is the best player that is realistically gettable? Even just dig deep and think about who we're not talking about. Is it, John Collins, but we've talked about him a bunch. Is it who? Is it people are going to, if it's OG Anunoby, and I don't think the Raptors are as quick to want to get rid of him as people think, that's also kind of a problem because he's not someone he's someone who makes your team a lot better. OG Anunoby is fantastic. But if you go and make a consolidation trade for OG Anunoby, is Donovan Mitchell, OG Anunoby, whatever's left over, is that still a contender? It's still the basis maybe for a longer-term vision, but you're still prioritizing the longer term. So, like, I respect the decision that the Jazz seem to be making here. I also don't think it's a coincidence that this came out right when the Miami Herald reported the Heat were doing everything within their power to get Kevin Durant. It was just sort of to reshift focus to, well, Donovan Mitchell's out here too. Like, you can throw your best offers on the table, and that just might be a matter of what this is. By Danny Ainge and co. So I think the Jazz, by moving Donovan Mitchell, I ultimately think they're making the right decision if and when that move actually happens. And I do think it's safe to say it's fait accompli. Now, maybe it doesn't happen right away. Maybe it doesn't even happen leading into the next season. But now that it's out there this much, that Woj phrased it and reported it the way that he did, it feels like this is the end. And it kind of felt like that for a while, but this is more so confirmation.